Welcome to Free Pilot Training. I'm Josh, and today I'm going to show you how to do a pre-flight or walk-around inspection on a Cessna 172. Now this is a Cessna 172H, but this inspection is going to be really similar to a lot of different training aircraft. So let's get going. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get in the cockpit and we're going to turn on a few things. All right, now that we're in the cockpit, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to turn on the master switch. And when we do that, I want you guys to listen up and let me know what you hear. All right, so right away, you probably notice some whirring sounds. And if you remember from some of our lessons, we've got some gyros in this airplane. Now, these two gyro-driven instruments right here are vacuum-driven, but this guy right here is electronic. So if you didn't hear that whirring sound, your turn and slip indicator could be bad, or your turn coordinator could be bad. So that's something to be aware of. You know, for VFR, it's not required, but for IFR, it is. All right, so the next thing, I'm going to come over here and look at the fuel gauges. And we want to take a mental note of what these are at. So, you know, 3/4 of a tank roughly. And when we go to check the fuel, we want to make sure that these are close, because that's another thing that's required for flight. Any flight, as a matter of fact, fuel gauges must be working properly. All right, and then next we're going to turn on all our lights. And then we're also going to go ahead and lower the flaps so we can inspect the flaps. All right, I've got the master on and all the lights, and something else you want to check if you have it is pitot heat. This particular airplane doesn't have pitot heat, but if you had it, you'd want to turn that on and come out here to make sure it's hot. Just kidding. It doesn't have pitot heat, I just told you guys that. All right, so after I check the pitot heat, you'd want to go ahead and turn that off if it's working properly, and then we come out here and check the lights. And what we want to do is we want to check to make sure all the lights we're going to need for this flight work. All right, so this one right here is one of the nav position lights. This is the red one. This is part of a 3-light set, and you got to have all 3 of them to fly at night. Here we got the landing and taxi lights. We need the landing light for commercial operations, and you never need a taxi light. We'll come over here and look at the green light, which is another part of the nav position lights. This is 2 of the 3 lights, and you need all 3 of them in order to be legal to fly at night. On the very tip of the tail, you'll see the last part of the nav position lights, and that's just a white light, a white solid light, and then up top we have a beacon. In addition to the beacon, newer planes will have strobes on the wingtips or sometimes on the belly, and you'd want to check those as well. All right, and then from here, we'll come back in here, turn our lights off that we're not going to need, and turn the master off, and we'll do the rest of the inspection. Now, when you first start doing walk-around inspections, you should really use the POH. That way you make sure you catch everything. But I like to use this checkmate checklist like this. And what I like to do is I like to walk around everything, check everything, and then come back to this checklist to make sure I got everything. All right, so the first thing I like to do is I like to check the sumps to make sure that we have good fuel. And the way we do that is we have a little poker thing on the end of this fuel tester, and we just push it up here in the sump and get a little bit of fuel out. And if there's any garbage or water in the fuel, you'll actually be able to see that. In fact, let me show you this real quick. We'll put a little water in here so you can see that it's pretty obvious if there's water in the fuel. All right, so if you'll see right there, you can kind of see a little bit of a line, and that's the water on bottom, and we've got the fuel on top. And that's how these sumps work. All the water comes to the bottom. This is the lowest part of the tanks, and we can get all that out that way. Now we've got a little bit of a problem. I can either dump this out on the ground and wait for the EPA to throw me in prison, or I could put it back in my tank and kill myself. I guess there's only one option here. Not too bad. Now, Cessna 172s and other training planes also have something called a strainer valve. And as you can see, we have a little knob right here. We can pull this out and drain a little bit of fuel out to get that out. And what you'll find is you'll come out here and it'll pour a little bit of stuff out on the ground. And as you can see, we've got stuff right here. And if you have water in this, you'll see kind of a lot of bubbles in this fuel that's on the ground. And it'll be pretty obvious when there's water in there. So if you see water, you know, give it a couple more hits on the strainer valve and then move on to the next thing. Okay, now I'll test the sump on the right wing here and see if we have any water. Yeah, maybe just a tiny bit. Let me go a little bit more here. Okay, I think I got everything on that one. Don't worry, it won't take too long and you'll start developing a taste for this stuff. A lot of trainer planes have one more sump down here at the bottom. where the fuel comes into the engine, so you want to make sure you check that as well. Looks like this one's pretty clear. I don't see any water in this one. All right, now we're done testing the fuel, but I'm going to hold on to this tester because it actually has a screwdriver on the end, and if I have any loose cowling screws, I can use this to tighten those up. So I'll go ahead and put this in my pocket for now, but now I'll go ahead and check the level of the fuel to make sure we have plenty of fuel for today's flight. All right, I'll go ahead and take this cap off, and if the fuel tanks are full, you could just check those to make sure they're full. If they're not full, like you see here, you might want to use one of these gauges right here. These are a pretty good way of knowing for sure how much fuel you have. So I'll throw this guy in here and I'll use it like a straw at a restaurant. It looks like I got about 12 gallons of fuel on this side. And that matches what we saw on the fuel indicator earlier, so I feel pretty good about that. And then make sure we get this guy locked and latched. Otherwise, you're gonna be losing fuel in flight. All right, so once again, I'll check this side the same way. I'll come in here, make sure we have plenty of fuel and that it matches what we have on the indicator. Looks like about 14 gallons on that one. And that's what we were roughly showing on the fuel indicator. So those are accurate. We got plenty of fuel for today's flight. See if I can get that back on there. And you want to make sure you get these on. This is really important. I like to do a double check to make sure both caps are on, and then we'll come down. That's the one thing bad about a high wing is once you come down here, it's difficult to see whether or not you got it on. I'm raising you guys way up, and it's still hard to see. So make sure you got those on while you're up there. All right, so now we're ready to do the complete walk around. And what I like to do is I like to start here at the oil, and I like to work my way backwards all the way around the plane and look at everything. So I'll start with the oil. That way, if I'm low on oil, I can run to the FBO and get that before I do anything else, or I can tell my instructor, hey, we need oil. And he can go ahead and start working that while I do the rest of the walk around. So the first thing I like to do, check the oil here, and it looks like we're about 6.5 quarts. This plane needs 6 to 8 quarts. If it's below 6, then you need more. And if you actually put more than 7 in this particular model, it starts coming out the top, so that's not really a good thing. And then I'll have you take a look inside here real quick. All right, so now what we want to check is we want to make sure that our dipstick is seated fully and it's not going to fall out on us on flight. I've actually seen that before, and so that's really important. You want to make sure your caps are all on. Make sure there's no bird's nest or anything in there. Make sure all your wires are connected. There's no visible damage. That's the main key. Looking in here and making sure that you don't see anything wrong. No big leaks, or your hoses and stuff are connected, and no big leaks. That's the big thing. Checking for visible damage. All right, we'll close this guy back up and continue the walk around. And make sure you get the cowling closed. That's really important. All right, before we move down and check the nose gear, we do want to take a look at our windscreen and make sure there's no cracks or none of these rivets are coming undone. This windscreen is really important because it protects us in flight. And then we've got these little hinges right here. Some newer 172s have removable hinges, and so you want to be sure that those little pins aren't coming out on you. Otherwise, your door could potentially fall off on you in flight. And here we have our static port. Make sure that's not painted or has anything in it. You don't want to touch that guy and get stuff in it, but if this hole is blocked, your instruments aren't going to read correctly. That's really important. All right, now that I'm down here at the nose gear, one thing I want to point out is, see this silver right here? There's really not a lot written about this, but what you'll find is that if you see less than about 3 or 4 fingers, then this cylinder needs to be serviced. And so this is actually probably a little bit over-serviced, but it's fine to be a little bit over-serviced. What I'm concerned about is if there's not enough fluid inside of there, and then the nose wheel comes down and you could damage some stuff in that way. But what we want to check on the nose wheel is to make sure all our bolts and stuff are connected, all the linkages are there, everything seems to be in working order. There's not any big cracks or anything on the linkage or the knuckles, and if it were, we'd be concerned about that. The wheel itself, we want to make sure that the wheel is attached properly. These have castle nuts on them, and what you'll notice is there's a little cotter pin in there that keeps that nut from backing off. So you want to make sure those are present and that nut's not going to fall off on you. And then as far as the nose tire is concerned, your biggest thing is you want to look to make sure that there's no cords showing. Bigger airplanes can have cords showing, but small trainers like this, you don't want to see any cords. And then when I was getting my private pilot's license, I always felt like it was necessary to check the air pressure. You don't have to do that unless you just suspect that it's low. But I don't suspect that this is low. In fact, these tires were just serviced, so I know they're good. All right, so from here, a lot of people don't teach you to check this, but I like to check the exhaust. And what I'm checking for here is I'm checking for black. Because if there's black inside the exhaust, that means that the mixture's been running too rich, and it could be difficult to start, and it could also cause me engine problems. And a lot of times you'll find that these exhaust pipes can be loose. You'll definitely want to get those fixed if they're loose. These aren't loose. I'm not seeing black. I'm seeing like more of a white color. That means that we're running at a good mixture. In just a second, we're going to check over the propeller. But before we do that, we're going to look inside here at the intake and make sure there's nothing in here. In fact, what you'll notice is, some airplanes, if they're parked out on the ramp, sometimes you'll have plugs in here in the intake. You want to make sure you take those out. I like to usually take those out at the beginning of the walk around. I like to take off all the plugs and all the covers. That way I have multiple chances to make sure I get all those off. And then throughout the walk around, I'll check to make sure I got everything off. That's really important. You don't want to forget any of the covers. All right, so from here we'll look inside, make sure no birds have built any nests. If your airplane has an alternator belt, you want to check the tightness on this. This one has a generator, so it doesn't have one of those. But we're checking to make sure no wires are frayed or anything like that. And big thing, if there's no plugs in this, birds can build nests in here. But this airplane's been hangared, so that's pretty unlikely unless a bird got in here and did that. So I still like to check it, but you definitely want to check that. And then down here, we have a little filter. Just want to make sure that this isn't super dirty and clogged up. Now we'll check over the propeller. All right, so when I look at this propeller, I'm mainly looking at the backside for gouges, dents, dings, that sort of thing. Because when the airplane's propeller bites, it's biting from the backside and pushing the airplane forward. So most of the damage that you'll find is actually going to be on the backside. So if you see any big gouges, cracks, or anything to that effect, not only can it affect the propeller structurally, but it can also cause it to be unbalanced, and that could make the engine wear faster. So we definitely want to check those to make sure that there's no visible damage. Okay, so once again on this side, I'm looking for the same thing I was looking for over there, making sure all my screws are tight on my cowling, making sure I don't have any cracks in the windscreen, no rivets have popped up. And then from here, I'm just going to move across the airplane. All right, so the first thing we have is we have a couple little intakes right here. Sometimes you'll get mud daubers building nests in these. You definitely want to make sure that those are free and clear. Make sure there's nothing, no kind of insects or anything inside those. If they are, you can clean those out. And they actually have little testing devices to test and make sure that those are free and clear. I don't have one of those to show you that. Or you can put your lips on it and test it that way too. That's an option. Once again, we have the little hinge pins here, making sure they're not going to fall out on us in flight. And then we'll move across the wing. It's actually pretty common for these little fairings to be cracked or damaged. These don't actually do anything structurally. They're basically just there to protect the joints and stuff and to make the airplane look good. So you shouldn't have to worry about those too much. But we are concerned about the struts. I'm looking for visible damage, making sure there's no dings or dents. This is a really important part of the airplane structurally. I want to make sure that this isn't going to break on me in flight. Checking the leading edge of the wing, making sure there's no dings or dents that's going to affect the airflow over my wings. And then you also have a lot of inspection panels here. And you want to make sure all those are on and present, because if an inspection was done, sometimes those won't be on there. And so you want to check to make sure those are present and somebody hasn't taken it off there to take a look inside the wing. All right, so same thing here. I'm checking across the whole wing, making sure there's no big dings or dents. Checking the underside, making sure there's no damage or any rivets coming undone. These fairings right here, a lot of times you'll see cracks in them. These don't really do a lot structurally, but they do protect the tip of the wing and allow wind to flow smoothly. If you have small cracks, those are fine on these fairings. But as far as like if it's breaking off or something, you'll want to get those replaced. And then we'll move back here to the ailerons. And these are really important to check. All right, so when I'm checking the ailerons, the main thing I want to check is one, I want to make sure they move freely. I want to make sure that they're not getting snagged on something out here. And a couple of the things you want to check. One, you'll notice some counterweights here, and this just helps balance the ailerons to make sure they fly right during flight. And then up here, it may be difficult to see, but there's actually some hinges in there that connects the ailerons to the wing. And what you'll find is, one, we've got bolts and nuts connecting the hinges to the wing, but you also have pins that connect these hinges together. And you might be able to see it, but there's little cotter pin type things that hold those little pins in place. And you want to check to make sure that those aren't missing so your hinges don't come apart in flight, and you know, your aileron doesn't come detached in flight on you. And so you just want to make sure that all those are connected. And then we also have this linkage right here. It may be difficult to see, but we want to make sure that's movable, but you know, not super loose and not going to fall off on us during flight. And as you can see, we have a few more inspection panels. Make sure that those aren't off or loose or anything like that. And then we'll move on to the flaps here. Flaps are interesting. They should actually be a little bit wobbly like that. I know that seems wrong, but that's the way it should be. If they're tight, they may actually jam up on you in flight. Now, this mechanism right here where the flaps roll up and down, this is really important structurally for the flaps. One, we don't want there to be any cracks, anything on these rollers. We want the nut and the bolt to be present. You know, no visible warping as far as the structure is concerned. We want this little linkage here to be movable, but not falling apart on us. Bolt, nut, same thing here, no big cracks. If there is cracks, you know, they may be here, between this right here, or, you know, on the roller system, and we've got a nut and a bolt there. And then we've already checked the sump over here, and once again, it doesn't look like anything's rubbing outside the aircraft. That's really important to check as well. No big dings or dents on the bottom edge of the flaps. All right, so now let's take a look at the main landing gear. And the tires on this are the same. If you see cords showing, it's best to go ahead and replace the tires. Once again, bigger airplanes can have cords showing. Trainer planes, I do not recommend having cords showing. We want to make sure that our brake lines are not leaking in any way. If you see fluid on the ground, that's a bad sign. It might be difficult to see from where you are, but there's also brake pads with the discs. If the brake pads are any narrower than your little tester thingy here, then you probably need to get the brake pads replaced. So that's basically my rule of thumb. If they're thinner than that, then I go ahead and get the brake pads replaced. And then we want to make sure that the tire's inflated properly. If it looks like it's not inflated properly, then I'd go ahead and check to make sure it has a proper PSI and check that. And then we've also got this big nut here, and a lot of these will have cotter pins on them to make sure that those nuts don't come undone during flight and you lose a wheel. So you want to make sure that cotter pin is present, and all these bolts and nuts are present on the tire itself, wheel and tire itself. In addition to all that, you can also check this arm right here, make sure there's no damage. These are pretty structurally sound, but you know, if somebody had a hard landing, you could see these like really bent or cracked, but it's pretty rare to see that, but I still like to look over that. Now in these armpit areas, it isn't uncommon to see like screws or rivets come undone, you know, especially because this is an area where the flaps are kind of close to the wing. So be sure to check and make sure that you're not missing any screws or rivets or anything like that. And if they were, actually this one might be missing one, I might have to get that replaced. But if they're missing something or something's loose, you can tighten that up. That way it doesn't get jammed on you in flight. And once again, we have another inspection panel here. All right, so when it comes to the back side of the wings, we're basically looking at the same thing. Visible damage, loose screws, rivets, inspection panels, make sure those are all on there. We still want this to be somewhat loose but not falling off or anything like that. We want to make sure all our antennas are present. And every airplane has a different antenna configuration, but you don't want any of them to be broken. You know, because those could be your GPS, your radios, your nav aids, all that type of stuff. So you want to make sure all those are present and not falling off. We'll check the fuselage, make sure there's no rivets or screws loose, windows are not coming out or anything like that. All right, and we'll continue with the tail here, another inspection panel. And on the leading edge of these horizontal stabilizers, it's the same as the front wing. You don't want any big dings or dents or anything like that. And there's actually an inspection panel under here as well. So you definitely want those to be present, no damage under the wing. And actually where the rudder connects here, you want to make sure that has a nut, a castle nut, and those linkages aren't going to fall apart on you in flight. Not any fraying on our cable or anything like that. And then we can look over the top of the horizontal stabilizer, make sure that looks okay. The vertical stab, make sure there's no big damage. Just like the wings and the horizontal stab, make sure there's no big dings or dents. And we can move the elevator a little bit. Just be careful when you do it. You don't want to get too aggressive and drop it and cause damage. But we want there to be a bolt and a nut connecting these. Bolt and a nut connecting these. Bolt and a nut. And this linkage, we want those to be on there. And now you don't want to move the rudder around too much because you could damage the controls. But you do want to look in here and make sure you have bolts and nuts. You know, bolts and nuts connecting everything. Bolts and nuts. Bolts and nuts. No big damage on the tail of the airplane. Rivets coming undone or anything like that. As you can see, our airplane has a little bit of cracking on the paint. That's totally fine. Same thing on this side. We're looking at this for the same stuff, bolt and nut. No big damaged items. Same linkage on this side. Making sure that thing's not going to come apart on us in flight. Check over the elevator here. Making sure we have a bolt and a nut on this side. Bolt and a nut. Bolt and a nut. Just gently move this around. Don't drop it. We want to make sure it's free, not rubbing on anything. And then the same thing as far as the vertical stab on this side. No visible damage. Same thing on this side over here. Baggage door. We want to make sure that this isn't going to come open on us in flight. Make sure that's latched nice and properly. And then we're going to check over this side just like we did over there. All right, so last but not least, I want to come out here to the front of the airplane and take one final look over the airplane. And I'll have the checklist with me, look through here and make sure I didn't forget anything. And so from here, it's a lot easier to see if anything's damaged and leaning, or if maybe one wing's hanging lower than the other, maybe one side of the flaps is hanging lower than the other. And we can just take our checklist right here and run through it and make sure we caught everything. Fuel quantity, fuel quality, we checked all those. Caps, drains, and vents. We might be able to see the top of our red caps, but I checked and double checked the tops if you remember. Engine oil and belt, we checked all those. Prop, air intake, those are checked. Exhaust system, we checked that. Stall indicator test. I have no way of checking the stall indicators without putting my lips on there, and I'm not doing that. Sorry, guys. Surfaces and controls, we checked all those. Pitot, static ports. We checked, actually there is one thing I forgot. We forgot to check the pitot system here. All right, so that's the exact reason why we use this checklist here. I forgot to check the pitot tube. And so this is actually a non-heated pitot tube, and it's got this little guy on it, which I'm indifferent about. You know, it actually works really, really well, but I think I'd rather have a heated pitot system where I actually could take the cover off. But it works really well. I want to look inside here, make sure there's, you know, nothing, you know, camped out inside. If I did have a heated pitot tube, what you'd find is a little hole on the back side to let water out. So if you had water in there, it could escape out the back, but this one doesn't have that. So I forgot to check that. This is why you look over your checklist. All right, gear, tires, and brakes, we checked all those. Antennas, we looked at those. Ties, chocks, tow bar. There's no tow bar. There's no ties on here because this airplane is hangared. Baggage door, we made sure we closed that. And final walk around. That's what I consider this right here as the final walk around, just checking over the rest of the checklist and making sure everything's done. All right, I think we're ready to go take off. Let's go. And that's how you do a pre-flight or walk-around inspection. Hey, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button. But before you go, here's to another successful walk-around inspection. That's good.